Welcome to Plus One Forward, the podcast powered by the Apocalypse, where we talk about tabletop role-playing games using or inspired by the Apocalypse engine. I'm your co-MC Rach.
And I'm your co-MC Rich. Today we are joined once again by the man behind the Indie Game Reading Club, Paul Beakley. Welcome back to the show, Paul.
Thank you for having me.
Paul recently completed around 20 sessions of the game Fellowship, is that right?
Yeah, I did.
Man, finished up 20 sessions, wrote a deep dive on your blog. We'll have a link to that in the show notes. You should check it out. I was excited to hear about a long-running game of Fellowship and how the mechanics scaled well for the group. See, Tyler Lomanek, who's a good buddy of mine, he ran a 10-session series of it for the Sunday night group. It was a couple of years ago, and we had a great time with it. So we're going to talk about scalability. Before we do, let me give one huge caveat, and that is that I need to stipulate Blades in the Dark as well as Forged in the Dark games are built differently from our classic PbtA style game that hew closer to Apocalypse World. I would personally argue that Forged in the Dark games scale extremely well, but they're built to scale in different and clever ways, some that unfold over long-term play. I'm 23 sessions into a Blades in the Dark campaign that a buddy of mine is running set in Star Wars. I've talked about it a few times before, but watching the tier changes and all of the different mechanics for turf is really exciting. And that's not something you see in most Apocalypse Engine styled games that are like Apocalypse World. And that's what we're going to talk. We're going to refer to them as PbtA games, but that's my giganto caveat. So please don't at me that Forged in the Dark has solved this problem. That's not what we're talking about tonight.
Yes, Forged in the Dark has solved that problem for Forged in the Dark, which is separate from Powered by the Apocalypse.
Right. We're not starting any edition wars as it stands. We just wanted to talk about scalability as they are designed for PbtA style games. And I gotta say, the PbtA style games that I've played usually are not built for long term. They're mini-series to extended series games. Now, I did just complete a year of playing one single PbtA game where I ran a couple of sessions a week for my wife, and near the end, she had +3s and every stat that she wanted. She never failed, didn't know what advances to buy anymore. We basically broke the game. And that was after 70-ish hour-long sessions. So I feel like I broke the warranty on that one. Yeah.
Yeah, the game owes you nothing after 70 sessions. That is so many sessions.
Yeah, now we're trying Stone Top. I'll tell you about that one later.
Nice.
Much later, like 70 sessions later. I wanted Paul to come on, mostly because I like talking to Paul. And also so we could talk about what can make a PbtA game scale well with a group. What works, what feels short-lived, and what games we've had the most fun playing slightly long term.
I think it's important to do another signpost here and ask an important question. We've talked about long-term play before on the podcast. How is scalability different? Just to share my perspective, when we talk about long-term play, we're talking about the intent. The group, as a collective, is intending to make this a longer-run game, and that's a choice they're making sort of socially. And in my mind, scalability is a bit more mechanical.
Mm-hmm.
It's how the game mechanically grows and supports your plans for a long-term game.
Right. We previously talked about what should a group do to lengthen out the play. Now we're talking about what games are designed or what game mechanics or mechanisms can be designed to help create that scaling effect.
Both long-term play and scalability feed into an idea that I heard discussed in gaming circles, especially as an organizer, the forever game. How would you describe a forever game?
I opened my piece with this idea that it's almost an article of faith in some gaming groups as part of a cultural thing that you start a campaign And without plans to stop it, the assumption is it will go on forever. It's the last game you'll ever play. But, of course, at the same time, almost all of these games just kind of shudder to a stop. Somebody moves away, or somebody gets bored, or a central character dies, nobody wants to proceed without them, or any number of things. Forever games are never forever games, but I think, like so many gamers, and maybe gamers of a generation, might be a generational thing. Because I think that kind of Platonic ideal was probably kind of a D&D era thing for me, like an 80s thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then we read these stories. I read one recently talking about somebody who's been running the same game in their home for 30 years now, 40 years. Literally thousands of sessions, decades of time going by. And I honestly don't know why that's a goal, because it's not a goal for me.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a useful lens to kind of look at Fellowship as, because it was the first PbtA, honestly, that I looked at and thought to myself, is this the sort of game you could literally play forever? And I don't think it is, but it's really close, and it gave me a lot of ideas into what it would take to get a PbtA game to that point where a future notional design could actually achieve that goal.
All right. That's what you're here for, Paul. Hit us with some of the things that would do that.
Okay, so our game ran for 20 sessions, which is hilariously short relative to other games, right? 20 whole sessions. Okay, I live in Phoenix, Arizona. This is all going to come around, okay? And in Phoenix, Arizona, we're a very young state, and we're a very young city. And there are high-rises in downtown Phoenix that are almost 100 years old. Almost 100. And the locals think that's astonishing. Oh my goodness, right? But of course, anywhere else in the country, anywhere else in the world, there are cathedrals that are 1,000 years old, and so on and so forth, right? So longevity is kind of in the eye of the beholder. But I think in the PbtA/indie scene, 20 sessions is absurdly long. It's the sort of thing you have to go play some other thing, like Pendragon, if you actually want to get an indie-like experience in a long form.
Right.
So in our game, very brief overview of how Fellowship works. You are always pursuing the Overlord, and the Overlord will always lose. And it's basically a sequence of queuing up your advantages to eventually go face the Overlord. And then the Overlord is defeated, and then the game is over. That sounds like a short-term game.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it is, because it has an end game to it. There is an end game. You achieve the end game, and it's over. But in our game, a few things came up mechanically and story-wise that made the game last a real good long time. One was the fact that they didn't have a sense of how many ducks in a row they would need to have in a row before they took on the Overlord. So early on, they were exposed to the big bad, and the big bad is catastrophically horrible.
Mm-hmm.
You can't be in the same room, you can't be in the same scene, you can't be on the same continent with the big bad because there's nothing mechanical or social or anything that you're nowhere in scale to it. And that's good. It's a good early setup. Like, this is such a long-term goal. Go home and start working on your plan. And they did that. And so it did scare them away from jumping back into the fray too soon.
Mm-hmm.
But that's all story stuff. Mechanically, advancement is pretty cool because the designer is really, really clever about writing moves. Just an endless move-making machine on her end. And so mostly the playbooks are full of just fantastically interesting moves that open up all kinds of new opportunities, but they don't make it better. They just give you more shit to do. Versus like going and grabbing level ups. One of our 3 players did that. He played the dwarf, and he just didn't know how to choose from among the moves. The moves didn't give him clear mechanical advantage. He was like, yeah, fuck it. I'm just going to give a +1 and +1 and +1. And pretty soon, 3 of his 5 stats were at +3. And sure enough, he succeeded like a lot. But succeeding a lot is also not set up in a way in that game such that success on a play-by-play basis actually can complete scenes. It's not a conflict resolution scale where I think a lot of PbtA is set up for that, where there's kind of a finale. You play it out blow by blow. I totally get that. But let's say old school apocalypse world. Seize by force isn't really a blow by blow thing. You seize it, whatever it is, apocalypse first ed, and you really are resolving the situation. You're in conflict, you're in combat, I'm trying to seize your life, I'm trying to seize control of this hard hold, whatever, right? And you roll it and then it's over.
Right.
And so we talk a lot about following the fiction and trying to figure out that perfect moment where the scene is broken down into little biteable bits that a move can resolve, right? And many moves resolve a lot of stuff at once. Fellowship is built in such a way that you can't really resolve anything with one roll. You have to do a lot of things to set up for the one roll. And it's purposeful.
Mm-hmm.
The final solve my problem move is called finish them. And to finish them, you have to have advantage. And to have advantage, you either have to talk through the fiction until you have a clear leg up over the other side, or you have rolled some other move that mechanically gives you a leg up on the other side.
Right.
One of those two things, and ideally both things have to happen. And so that all by itself helps kind of lengthen out play a little bit. And so you're not grinding through so much fiction in a session, a 3-hour session or so. We're playing about 3 hours or so. And less stuff happens, but the detail, the focus on those things is a little bit more intense, a little more trad. Mm-hmm. It's not quite blow by blow. You're not quite like roll to hit, roll for damage, roll for defense, roll for hit, roll for damage. It's not that, but it's also not, did I roll to beat the guy? Oh, I beat the guy. Okay, time to move on to the next thing. That is a big part, I think, of how the game lasted longer, was just did less. Mm-hmm. And the stuff we did was a little more intentionally focused. The other thing that happened is we were able to expand the scope of play a few different times. The big one, the most memorable one, was we were able to give the Fellowship, the players, a flying ship. This sounds like a piece of gear, right? But the flying ship comes from Inverse Fellowship, which is the second of 3 frameworks you can play Fellowship in. The first one is Basic Fellowship, where you're playing against the Overlord. The second framework is Inverse Fellowship, where you're playing against the Horizon. And the idea is that you're wandering around the world. It's based on Inverse World, which was an Apocalypse World thing a bunch of years back. Mm-hmm. And the Horizon is basically going from community to community, and you're facing some dickhead who's making the community suffer, and you deal with that community's problems, and then you move on. And it's exploring and problem solving, and it's the A-Team forever.
I was going to say, that's a 1980s action TV show.
It's a 1980s action TV show. The third one is Fellowship and Rebellion, where the Overlord has won the fight, and now you're running the Rebellion to go take back everything. Right. So, Inverse Fellowship, you can have the ship. In fact, that's kind of the core thing. And you have your flying RV, or it's a giant drill, or it's a boat, or whatever it is. But it comes with a massive subsystems and little mini-games, and it comes with its own stats, and you have to spec out your ship with its own moves and its gear, and it levels up on its own. It's its own character, more or less. And because of the moves it comes with, it dramatically expands the scope of the game. Mm-hmm. And so, until the ship was present in the game, we didn't know that the evil Elven Empire themselves had an aerial armada of their own, because now there's moves that reference things like spotting other flying vessels. Well, if you have a move to spot other flying vessels, we surely must introduce other flying vessels for that move to spot, right?
Exactly.
It's Chekhov's flying vessel gun. There's another one that hands over agency to one of the players, whoever's playing the Navigator. The Navigator can now start specifying that their sensors can now see settlements on the ground beneath them. Well, not my job anymore to spec out settlements. Now there's spotting, in scare quotes, settlements. They're inventing new settlements. And so the game has just now handed over a bunch of new toys and has tricked the players into being co-GMs, where they wouldn't normally want that agency, and now they've got the agency.
I just realized that's what's happening. Is like, oh, don't worry, MC or GM. You don't have to think of any new plot points. Your players are just going to start throwing them at you.
That's exactly it. That's totally it. And that's what happened in our game. And the game does a lot to trick the players into being co-GMs. And I think that's another part of the long-form play, is it's not all coming out of my head. And so I'm not so worn out by the effort from session to session. There's this marvelous system for journeying from location to location in Fellowship. And ostensibly, because the original Fellowship game is a very reskinned Lord of the Rings, and it's expanded far beyond that. But the journey is that crane shot or the drone shot of everyone walking along the ridge somewhere in New Zealand with beautiful mountains in the background and sweeping music. But in the game, everyone's responsible for setting a scene, describing a problem, and nominating somebody else to solve that problem. Not saying how they solved it, but, hey, player A, how is it that we solved the problem of discovering that we had been camping on the back of an ice giant this entire time? The ice giant just woke up. I didn't know there was an ice giant there. Cool. So really, I think that did a lot of work, was the fact that there's a lot of time and energy spent reintegrating other people's kind of wacky ideas. And it is a wacky game. There's not that real tight-fisted controlling GM as producer and continuity editor role in the game. It's everyone's job to be each other's continuity editor and make sure you can include each other's stuff. But that's procedural. That's a rule. That's how journeys work, and I think that was a big part of it as well. So that's the overview of how Fellowship works really well as far as long-term play. And it ultimately fails to do so because it has an end game.
I was going to say, right? Because that's baked into the game is you have an overlord. The overlord has to fall. And as you said, the overlord will always fall.
So here's how we're going to do our next 20 sessions. If we ever pick this up again, and I think we will, is the way the overlord is beaten is the overlord has, when you first take the overlord playbook, it's actually the GM's playbook. And the GM has stats, and the GM has moves. It's totally dope. I love it to death. But part of setting up the overlord is, like, what's their motivation? You never share it with the players. One of them is, there's a giant jerk. They just want the power because they want the power. That's cool. Another one is, they honestly believe they're doing the right thing, and they are the hero of the people. Also, fine. The one I chose was, the overlord is actually working in the service of another larger overlord. And,
oh, no!
and that is only revealed when the first overlord is beaten. And so I did exactly that. It was a big bum at the end. And so now we find out that Overlord 1 was actually just possessed by the spirit of the real overlord, who has her own playbook and her own set of everything and her own plan and blah, 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 blah. Is that a rug out from underneath you? Maybe. Maybe it is. Maybe for the players. But you don't have to play the next session. You can just say, oh, well. Or you can say, oh, fuck yeah. We're going to play another 20 sessions of this and go after the next overlord in this huge elaborate setting that we've all co-created.
Wow. That's really cool.
It's really cool.
You've had some time to think about this, reflect upon your 20 whole sessions of Fellowship. What are some things that you think would help support long-term play in PbtA that maybe does or doesn't exist in what we just talked about with Fellowship?
I think the adding a new large fictional ingredient was so effective. I'm really enamored with the effect that had in our game. The ship had a bunch of rules that came with it. And that gave the gearhead something to chew on, and it gave everybody kind of talk about. It gave us a bunch of new NPCs, but I would pay attention to that in the games that allow that more as a fictional tool, like acquiring a crew or acquiring a hard hold, or I think, God, in Stone Top, is there something like that? You're playing it now? I'm just now reading it.
Yeah, there are steading rules that definitely you're building up your village. That's one of the things that attracted me to the game.
So in Stone Top, when you add to your steading, is it just kind of points on a page, or is there other stuff that comes with that?
It's a bit of both. There are some points on a page that also open up narrative changes, evolutions, new opportunities for roleplay.
Yeah, cool. So I think that's my current best in class. That idea where you might get some mechanical advantage, but the real point of it is just to open up a whole new area of play to think about. New NPCs and new agendas and new. Talking
about gaining the ship in Fellowship, That's funny. Reminds me of how our game of Legacy Life Among the Ruins that my partner Rob ran, how he set up the game mechanics. And I'm just curious, Paul, if you feel this is disingenuous. There are a lot of mechanics in Legacy Life Among the Ruins. So how Rob managed that is he started with just the most bare bones mechanics and then entered more mechanics and goals to be pursued through play slowly over several sessions to onboard them, which ended up extending out the game by producing novelty because you had an idea of, okay, this is the set of tools we're playing with right now, but now do you want to pursue a radio tower? Do you want to pursue the Tartarus pit? But those were not on the table initially. So I guess what I'm saying is, do you feel it's disingenuous to the game to slowly roll out larger mechanics in pursuit of scalability, or do you think it's more honest just have it all out on the table initially?
Oh, man. So totally a table culture thing.
Mm-hmm.
I've got players who like the rules, and they want to know all the rules because they want to have all the rules at their fingertips. They want to have every opportunity for mechanical advantage available to them early. Some players hecking hate the rules, and they just kind of want to say what they want to do, and then the GM will tell them how to render that into rules speak.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
But man, the Legacy games are so dense, they're so elaborate. I've played almost all of them now. I played Legacy first, Legacy second, Shattered City, another 20 sessions.
Mm-hmm.
Free from the Yoke, I've fired up 3 times and haven't quite gotten it to take. I mean, actually, it's on my short list of the next thing to actually try to get it to roll out. So Shattered City, my player who's the biggest problem child who doesn't like to learn rules didn't play that one.
Ah.
The player who is the most about achieving and maintaining mechanical advantage did play that one. And so it was a more mechanistic table, and it worked out great. And man, Legacy is also a terrific tool for long-term play.
Mm-hmm.
The turning of the age table and all the cool new things that you add to the setting and adding new things to the physical math. And Shattered City is the same basic setup as that. Also the turning of the ages, you're playing new characters, and sometimes dudes die, and sometimes you got to play a little secondary character for a while before you get back. Oh, fantastic. It'll play forever. But I don't think it's disingenuous. I wish I played at a table where I could do that intentionally and not make the gearheads really angry at me.
Mm.
And I wish I could play at a table where the not gearheads didn't feel completely left out when you have that kind of long period of time where you're playing at the faction phase, the faction level game, where you're making
the higher level.
Right. So the people who don't understand it or don't understand the economies, you take this move to feed the economy to that other player over there. And it's great if you all know you can see the football you're passing from move to move to move. I'm doing this move to give you this advantage so you can make that move, so you can do this favor for me so you can make that move. I love that. But the players who aren't into it are like, wake me up when it's time to go. Because I'm not going. I'm playing a faction. I'm not even playing my character. Who cares about this stuff? This is all GM stir the pot kind of stuff that the GM should be responsible for. I've actually heard that before told to me. Like, why am I doing this? This is the GM's job.
Oh, wow.
That's mean.
Yes.
We did have to have a discussion, or I think the conclusion our table came to, if I remember correctly, it was your faction's interests might not always align with your character's interests. So do what your faction would do and make it interesting for the table on like a higher level. And then we can drill down and you can see how your character reacts to the poor decisions your faction made.
How often did you guys do a faction turn?
I do remember it happening fairly frequently. I could not count out the amount of sessions. I believe there was something happening on a faction level each session.
Whoa. At the table, when you shifted to the faction phase stuff, did you find that people were having a hard time kind of shifting up and down?
No, but we had a fairly experienced table. 2 of our players actually run tabletop role-playing games for children in a summer camp situation, so they were used to shifting up and down.
Yeah.
Me and Rob and Agatha had played a lot of games at that point that did require that microscope-ish, not to name drop games, sense of now I'm going up a level and looking at it from the higher level, and now I'm going back down and sliding into character again. However, I do know players within the gaming community who are very invested in that character as an entity that I would not put that game in front of.
Right. Yeah, probably needs to come with a warning label. Did you find that the faction stuff did extend the game out, or did it just kind of burn up some of the hours of your session you could have been spending just role-playing?
It got the whole table really invested in looking at how the world was going to evolve over time, because we wanted to see what was going to happen on a political scale, and then, again, take that step down and see, well, how do characters react to it? I believe when we made it into the Second Age, all the characters were in outright rebellion of their factions. We were a group of mercenaries doing terrible things to the status quo, but at the same time, we were also deciding how is the status quo going to both react to this shit disturbing going on and also try to further their interests.
Nice. That's good. Yeah, I think that's exactly the intent of the thing, too, right? None of my Legacy and Legacy derivative games have ended on, like, a finale. They've all done the old D&D thing, where we're just kind of, like, dissolved. And it wasn't for lack of interest. It might have been for lack of interest, but it was under the guise of things like somebody moved away, or a pandemic happened, and what do you do about that, you know? And
yeah, the pandemic dissolved our game.
Right, exactly. I don't know. In that case, I almost wish there was more of an end game, or at least an end game signal to aim for, kind of like Fellowship, where you've got a thing, you'll know when you've gotten to it. In our case, in Fellowship, you could play the next Overlord, you could switch over to Fellowship and Rebellion and play another game in the same setting, or whatever. But like Legacy, I don't know that she ever talks about a suitable stopping point. We've reached an era that is so far advanced that it no longer makes sense with our system or anything like that. I wonder if that wouldn't be a better thing, because then it's like we can grind it out a few more sessions. That happened to us in Band of Blades, where we were 3 locations from the end of Band of Blades, and we weren't universally loving it, but we played for 5 more sessions to get through those, because we knew we'd get to them. It extracted more play out of it, but it meant having to kind of suck up some, like, less than stellar play to get to the end of it. But then it got good again, because sometimes you have a not great session, but you can just stick it out a little bit longer. Another cultural thing, right? Some people are just like, nope, I'm out. Had a bad session. Who cares? And there's so many people, they can just kind of like do the iPod thing and just jump to a new track and not listen to the whole album. Not mechanical. This isn't mechanical stuff. This is more talking about long-term play stuff. But I think there's something to it, honestly. This idea that if there is an end game you're playing toward, that may help you get a bridge through the slow nights, the table vibe is off, the chemistry is kind of misfiring.
We talked a little bit about how Fellowship has an end game. Are there any other Powered by the Apocalypse games you can think of, Paul, that have end games?
Uh-huh. My other favorite end game, Space Worm versus Unicorn.
Beautiful game.
Love it. Underloved. So terrific. I would run that one again in a heartbeat. So good. I've run it a few times as one-shots and as the full campaigns. We've ended it for real twice. And it's great. Same thing. Same idea. Where Johnstone even says, if you quit this game, Space Worm has won. Which is cute. It's very meta. It's very cute. But I liked that. And it wasn't enough to keep us playing. We kind of didn't want to play. Maybe, maybe not. But I would always like raise an eyebrow and say, guys, if we're not getting together next week, Space Worm. And then people would be like, no, not on my watch. And they get back in. And they just get back into it. Yeah, so that's another one that occurs to me as having the same effect. You stick it out just a little bit longer, or maybe you had an okay session, maybe even a bad session. I mean, there are bad sessions too, right? Straight up bad. You just effed up some thread you were working on, or didn't have enough creative whatever that night. But, gosh, how about you, Rich? Any other games with endgames?
In the PbtA space, I feel like mechanically there are not story endgame, but the adult moves for masks, the advances for retiring your character in Apocalypse World, Monsterhearts, the growing up moves, those all feel like end games that are built within kind of early first generation-ish PbtA games.
I like those too, actually. I really like all those because you didn't win, you just changed.
Mm-hmm.
This all game change state stuff, which is bittersweet, and it fits with the genre and Masks and Monsterhearts. I like those a lot. Those are really nice.
I find it interesting in my own personal experience. So if someone's listening and they're like, oh, I've totally done that. That's cool. In Apocalypse World, 1st, 2nd edition, very rarely do people retire their characters to safety. I can think of one time when someone brought in a second character to play.
Yeah.
And these are definitely scalable actions that can extend the life of an Apocalypse World campaign quite a bit. They're built in there. They're mechanically there. Not something that I've seen people geared towards utilizing.
In the same vein, one that I have never personally used is changing playbooks.
Yeah.
Any of the games where you can change a playbook, I think my players have always felt invested in this character, in this playbook, with this identity, and this set of agency, and this set of expectations, and changing that is hard. It's almost harder than just making a new character. And it feels like it's sort of in the same zip code as the retiring to safety, because if you're going to keep playing beyond that, it means making a new character. And I wonder if some of that's the baggage of feeling like, well, I'm like 7 advances behind everybody else, I'm going to suck. And
I'm laughing inside because I both shifted playbooks and retired a character, and it was the same character in an Apocalypse World game. That was a one-on-one game. She started as a water bearer and then broke all of her laws in one go and had NPCs point out, you busted all your laws. You can no longer be in control. And I said, I guess I'm a driver now. And that's what happened.
But it was one-on-one, right? You didn't have to other players to contend with, right? If you were dropping in as a brand new cherry driver next to a gun lugger with 5 advances, would that feel weird? Same?
It feels weird on that scale level of conversation for me. I've seen people change playbooks from season change in Monsterhearts, often changing skins. For some reason, like, oh yeah, it's the end of the season. It's a new season. And therefore, my mortal is now a vampire. I've seen that.
Sure.
It's great. It's fun. That's a thing that gives new life, breathes new life, and allows you to change scales because you've moved from one season's big bad to the next season. Like, what is this? What's the major struggle here in this particular season?
The TV metaphor helps.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Because shows have seasons, and seasons end, but then they start up again. And they have an easily identifiable kind of short arc. And it's nice because you may not get renewed the next season. And so every season is kind of an ending-ish, except for the shows that they know they're going to have another season. And it's all cliffhangers.
Mm-hmm.
That's a nice metaphor. Like Urban Shadows, 1st edition, I'm really looking forward to seeing what 2nd edition does with this. But, I mean, they have a pot stirring move too, but the pot just gets stirred.
Mm-hmm. I
don't know if the scale changes so much, just kind of more ingredients get thrown in the same size pot. Everything just kind of gets more complicated, but the pot never feels like it gets bigger. Because it's always in your city, by definition.
Yep.
Right.
I think it's hard in Urban Shadows to reach out and, I don't know, I guess werewolves can't buy plane tickets, or they don't buy plane tickets. They just kind of stay in their space, their barrio, or their whatever. Kind of a weird contrivance of Urban Shadows that there's not a more international, but I bet you could really grow the Urban Shadows game a lot that way. If you played Chicago, and LA, and Sydney, or whatever. You know.
CSI-esque spin-offs of your main campaign.
That's right. That'd be hot. I do think... structurally, fundamentally, PbtA games, you got to go through so much extra different effort to make them scale in interesting ways because the GM doesn't have any stats.
Mm-hmm.
It's true.
I can't throw a bigger dragon at you. It's just the dragon that I said it is. I can't throw a bigger monster at you with better attacks and stuff. I guess I can give it better moves, but there's no math behind it. I think it's not a problem. It's just a fact. That you can't make the numbers go up. The lines can't all go up and then create the illusion that everyone's getting better.
Yeah. One of the problems that I've had with longer games is that folks get so many playbook moves. And now they've got playbook moves, they've got basic moves, and then there could be situational moves, peripheral moves, that those playbook moves just fall by the wayside because they're often a little more niche, a little more specific, and really on the player to engineer to lean towards those moves. And that's something I enjoyed about Dungeon World at higher level play, is that it literally scales. You have to have this move in order to get this advanced move, and this advanced move is just a slightly better version of that older move. It replaces it now. So you still have the same number of bits to track, but your bits are getting better to scale with a bigger monsters.
Yeah, I like that tech as well.
Yeah.
And I don't know that I've seen that many other places either, where you start with a move and the move gets better.
Right.
The advanced version of a move. That's pretty hot, except when your stack gets better. Then it just fires off more often.
Right. Although XP on a miss, better stats, it's its own, like that. I understand that economy. It's like, okay, well, I'm going to get XP because I failed a lot. Therefore, I'm going to buy up this stat. Now I fail less. So I stagnate a little bit. That's a design decision. It's not super fun, but it is a design to keep people from always getting that level up, always getting those XPs for failures.
Or if you care, it creates the player deal where your fighter now spouts lore all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Because, like, they want to hit their shitty stat so they can keep advancing, right? And that's also on the assumption that everyone's incentivized by advancement. And not everyone is incentivized by advancement. I think it's taken as an article of faith, but I think there's an assumption there that players are naturally drawn to advancement. And I don't think it's always true. And I think if you figure out that that's not always true, that is very much part and parcel to extending your long-term play. Because you need to find what they are incentivized by and start offering those things up, because eventually you will run out of advancement.
How do we feel about advancing basic moves? I've seen some games play around with that idea, especially when you get into the advances, as it were, that you advance your basic moves instead of taking, as Dungeon World does, which is advancing your playbook moves.
Well, that's Apocalypse World, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think there's an entire set of advancements on the basic moves. I like those because we're all looking at them all the time. We're all, like Rich was saying, I think it's easy to forget that players have moves, and it's easy for the players to forget that they have their own moves, unless they're extremely excited to use their special thing, which that's another incentive type.
Right.
It's a particular kind of spotlight time. You know, I'm doing this cool trick that nobody else has. I'm commanding a gang, or I'm doing whatever that might be. But I love advancing the basic moves. I think it's really nifty, especially if the advancements produce something more than more picks off of the Rita Sitch list, or it's just more, if it's different.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you can ask a question not on the Rita Sitch list. That's fantastic. Because now you're inviting the player to be creative and come up with some question and be a little subversive. Ask a question that you wish was on that original list, that very constrained list.
Paul, you mentioned earlier about listening to your players and figuring out what excites them, what compels them that might not be a mechanical advancement. Are there things that you've given your players that they desire that might not be something suggested in the game, that might be thinking outside of the box?
I thought a bit about the different things that incentivize players beyond advancement. I think spotlight time is a huge one. Just being paid attention to, getting to have your piece, right? And I think that works out really, really well. Another one is giving something to somebody that's really unique and special, so that they now possess the unique thing, even if it's not providing mechanical advantage or even spotlight time. If somebody has the very cool magic sword that speaks, and they get the same amount of time as anybody else, but now they get to have a scene with their sword talking to them. That's not exactly spotlight time, I think. It's more of a novel thing. In our Fellowship game, I expanded out the storyline such that the big bad was opening up dimensional portals to parallel Earths that were close to, but not the same as our own Earth. And when the character whose player really enjoyed having something kind of special had an opportunity to get a new follower, I gave that player a copy of his own character as a parallel copy from an alternate Earth.
Oh, no.
He was playing Mel from Green Earth, and then Blue Mel from Blue Earth showed up and was now an NPC following him around. And that would give us a little special one-on-one, like, I'm going to pretend I'm you, the player. I'm going to use your voice. I'm going to, that kind of thing. But it was special. It wasn't better by any means. In fact, it was frequently worse because he kept picking up more copies of his own character. So he had like a whole little army of copies of his character following him around as copies from alternate Earths, and they all had their own takes. This one is the sassy one who always has a better joke, and this one's like the very aggressive one who always knows what to do. And it was like a chance to editorialize, but it was special, it was novel, even if it was not really like more time. It was just different time, weird time.
That's incredible. Oh my gosh. I need to steal this idea and apply it somewhere.
I loved it so much. It was so much fun. Giving players, this is very old school. Back in the day, if you had a wallflower in a dungeon crawl, you'd make that player the mapper. And their job would be to map the dungeon because they weren't going to be role-playing, they weren't going to be saying much, but they'd have a piece of paper in front of them and be doodling all the time. And that's a non-diegetic, it's outside of the play space, right? But like sometimes you got to give players like a special responsibility for stuff. And it kind of works. It gives them an incentive to show up because, well, I can't let my players down. I've got to draw the map, even if I don't really care about the playing so much. But they're there and they're doing the thing. And they're not being forced to pursue advancement. They're not being forced into having lengthy scenes with each other, with a player or whatever.
This reminds me a bit of, and it's not a PbtA game, but the game Ryotama has that level of every member of the party has a role, and one of them is the mapper. One of them is the quartermaster who has to manage how much water they have. And it's just book work, but it's meant to keep certain types of players engaged.
Oh my gosh, some people love that shit. I don't get it. I hate it, but I'm glad someone loves it. Another one I have had to provide to players is the opportunity to have a knockdown, drag-out argument. Some people love to argue, and most games don't mechanically support real acrimonious character disagreements that well, right? It usually devolves back to like a social level kind of thing, but some players fucking love to fight. They love it. Therefore, their characters love it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is sometimes a thing I need to offer, is a chance for a big fight. But since I'm the GM and they're a player, player-to-player fighting is terrible. And character-to-character fighting is not well supported. But character-to-NPC fights are marvelous. Because they don't fall into the same win-lose kind of thing. I don't have to win my side of the argument. I can let the Wookiee win, but I can still put up a good fight along the way. So they had to make their points and have their big stand-up speeches and everything else. And that's, I guess, a specialized kind of spotlight time. But it's a specialized, like, emotionally charged bit of spotlight time. Above and beyond just listening to the player describe their stuff. It's a weird one, but it comes up. I've had it happen a few times now. I've got a couple players who are really into being able to have a nice, loud fight.
We've name-dropped a lot of games over the course of this episode, but as we're wrapping up, the two of you, are there any specific games you might want to suggest to a player who's going to go off and start Googling for some PDFs to buy of a PbtA game that will scale really well?
Let's lead off with Apocalypse World. I know it's not perfect, but I really feel like there are aspects of that game that if folks say, hey, we want to play on we want to start small and we want the scope to change and scale well, I feel like there are a number of advancements built into the playbooks that do that. Okay, you've got a holding. Okay, you've got a gang. Okay, you've got the cult like from the Hocus. There are a lot of those bits built in already that bring a second character into play, retiring that character and then creating somebody brand new. Well, yes, as we previously discussed, there are some, like, I don't want to be weaker than the others bits, and I feel you, but those things are there and they're real and they can help a game to live a pretty broad life. And it feels weird talking about Apocalypse World games without saying that, hey, Apocalypse World has bits to do the thing.
If we're going to talk about the genius of the bakers, I gotta say, I'm really looking forward to spooling out Under Hollow Hills in a long format. I think it does some really, really interesting stuff, and it feels maybe also a little friendlier to the prospect of playing multiple playbooks. The game doesn't have moves, it's got plays. How are you going to play this? How are you going to play that kind of scene? But some of the plays do that trick, because I think it's a trick that they like. I would recommend that on its own merits, but in particular in terms of like mechanically scaling up over the course of a long round of play. I think it's going to do it really, really well.
We talked a bit about Monsterhearts earlier this episode, which does have seasons that can run very short, but your TV show doesn't have to get canceled after one season, right?
Right.
It's not a Netflix show. I'll also say that I've had a lot of fun with masks. It also has those ways out for particular characters while continuing the story of your city and the supers there. A little bit of legacy in that you can have your character become a grown-up superhero and you bring in somebody new. I ran a Supers high school game that lasted quite a while. I would say probably 3 seasons, although we didn't define them as seasons because comics. But there was aspects of folks coming into play who were playing the like child version of the adult parent of one of the player characters, and it was so good and messed up and really, really, really fun. And the scalability of that game is pretty cool because you can go from small moments to gigantic, huge citywide fights.
I think Night Witches is probably worth bringing up, although the prospect of playing Russian heroes might not be awesome here and now today in this day and age.
Yeah.
True story. But it's got a nice baked-in campaign. You got the entire X number of stations you go to, and you pass around the GMing, and it's almost the platonic ideal of kind of a long-form play game with a known ending at the end.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Jim Crocker ran the full Night Witches series for the Gauntlet a few years back, and there were folks who were in from session 1, but he also ran it within the Gauntlet, so there were people who cycled in and out.
Oh, nice.
It was really, really cool.
What I'm kind of curious about playing, and this is going to be a little off of center a bit, but what does Ironsworn look like in the very long term? Are there people out there grinding at their solitaire play for maybe hundreds of small sessions? I ran a bunch of Ironsworn for myself, and you can do it in like about half an hour, maybe 15 minutes at the least, right? But there's like no sessions. You just kind of sit down, play the game for a bit, put it away. But I wonder if you've ever like added it all up, and it turns out that people have been playing, months of playtime. But it's hard to tell that because it's all happening incidents by incidents, whatever the right word for that would be.
I think Nawal has a lot of scalability built in because you have different levels to your Nawality. Mm-hmm. There is a bit of an end game built into that because you eventually ascend. Also has a Changaro, which is your place of business, the thing you were talking about with the ship from Fellowship.
You got NPCs that are coming in and new challenges to your business. And Yep. Looking forward to that one as well.
It's a great game. Rach, did you have any game wrecks you wanted to throw out?
I love me some long-term, really complicated urban shadows. I know that's not everyone's cup of tea because you can really get a big pool of NPCs going. The NPC weight will probably crush an urban shadows game before the stats get out of control, to be completely honest. But I enjoy it.
Nothing else I'm looking at really tells me this is a game that you could play for a long time. None of them are forever games. I don't think PbtA is ever going to maybe be that game. I'd love to see the purpose-built one-shotty things like Zombie World. What does that look like in long-term play? No idea. It's so card-based. There's not really advancement. I guess there is, but not the way we think of it. I suppose you could explore a lot of narrative.
You make it about the crew. You become very Walking Dead about it, in that some player characters will last for a while, but nobody's going to make it to the end. It's all about the ensemble moving and shifting. I got a dozen sessions out of Zombie World.
Dozen sessions.
Wow.
It was great. We were down to we ended one session after the one character who had been there since the beginning getting bit, and it was tragic.
That's a good ending. That's an outstanding ending. I suppose that game, too, kind of has an endgame baked into it.
Oh, yeah.
In the premise.
There's a lot of endgames.
Yeah.
Thank you again, Paul, for coming on the show and speaking with us today. If our listeners want to follow more of your work, where can they find you online?
They can find me at the indiegamereadingclub.com.
All right. Well, thanks again, Paul, for coming on and sharing your wisdom about scalability.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you, Rach.
Plus One Forward is a production of the Gauntlet community, Richard Rogers and Rach Shelkey. You can find us at gauntlet-rpg.com or follow us on Twitter at +1FWD. If you would like to support our show, visit our Patreon site at patreon.com/gauntlet. The games mentioned on this show use the Apocalypse engine, which is a creation of Vincent and Magay Baker. The music for Plus One Forward is from the Savage Aural Hotbed CD Gomi Daiko. The songs used are Gomi Daiko, Metal Version, and Hammer of Bill. You can find more amazing tunes by Savage Aural Hotbed on their website, www.savageauralhotbed.com.
You can now get Hearts of Wulin Worlds on DriveThruRPG. This supplement for Hearts of Wulin includes alternate settings and new mechanics. In it you'll find Shadow of the Joseon, a historical Korean setting, 1905 San Francisco, Chinatown in the shadow of the Chinese Exclusion Act, Corps de la Épée, a fantastic swashbuckling France, Academy of the Blade, an anime-inspired dueling school, Fight Me IRL, a cyberpunk corporatized future, and Silk and Steam, a silk-punk fantasy setting. As well, Hearts of Wulin Worlds contains a new core playbook, detailed options for running wuxia mysteries, and more. You can get the PDF, as well as the core Hearts of Wulin book, at our drive-thru publisher site, bit.ly/gauntlet-publishing.